Good evening and welcome to Zion Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Janine Johnson, and I'm the Director of Outreach here, and we are just so pleased that all of you have been willing to come and spend your evening with us as we talk about things that are important and dear to all of us, and that's affordable, safe housing. So we just thank you all for being here, and we're going to kind of keep things moving along, so I'm going to open with a prayer. Let us pray. God of compassion and wisdom and justice, through your Spirit, we come together tonight to listen, learn, and look to the future of safe housing in our community. Open our hearts and minds to the ideas being shared tonight. Help us to see and embrace the importance of safe, affordable housing for the well-being and productivity of all our sisters and brothers who live in these Quad Cities. Give insight and knowledge to council people, property owners, property managers, and renters, as all look for ways to work with each other to create truly the best living environment for all who live here in the Quad Cities. God of peace, guide this gathering of people who care deeply for this community as they talk and listen to each other. Be present with us and hear our prayers. Amen.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Housing Justice Community Forum. My name is Ruth Quick, and I am a member of the Quad Cities Tenant Alliance. The Quad Cities Tenant Alliance is a current project of Quad Cities Interfaith. We organize tenants to build power in order to set a public policy agenda that seeks safe, decent, and affordable rental housing. QCTA organizes renters because we believe that the people closest to the problems are also closest to the solutions. QCTA says yes to a democracy where renters have a say in the decision that affects our lives. And we believe that housing is a human right. Every week, members of the QCTA go door to door at apartment complexes. We ask fellow renters to join us in shaping and advocating for policy that addresses their issues. Over the past year, we have collected more than 400 contacts. One of our greatest successes so far was at my building, Jackson Renaissance Senior Campus, where we organized meetings with the Iowa Finance Authority and Alderwoman Jade Burkholder to solve a major accessibility issue in our building. Sorry. Okay. The Housing Justice Community Forum is the result of the hard work of dozens of tenants and allies who have contributed their time and stories to the developments, solutions to the problems with renting in the Quad City problem, like rent hikes, evictions, and the rental housing shortage, to name a few. We are excited to present you our proposal for a rent abatement ordinance, which excuses tenants from paying rent when inspections reveal a threat to life and safety. Tenants shouldn't pay if we can't stay. We believe that a rent abatement ordinance is an important step towards addressing one of the biggest threats to housing justice in the Quad Cities right now, the involuntary displacement of tenants. In recent years, we have suffered a number of highly visible mass displacement events. I first became aware of the problem of tenant displacement in the Quad Cities when the building collapsed at 324 Main Street. Last week, we remembered the lives lost: Brendan Colvin, Ryan Hitchcock, and Daniel Prian. Today, We also remember the dozens of tenants who lost their homes, all because of irresponsible landlord refused to comply with the city code. But the problem of involuntary displacement didn't start or end with 324 Main Street. Remember the Crestwood apartments in 2021? More than 100 Davenport families were displaced. Remember the Schricker apartment this Easter? We saw 18 people displaced. We're talking about sparks flying from electrical boxes. We're talking about mushy walls, black mold, and mushrooms growing because of leaky roofs and pipes. These kind of problems don't pop up overnight. Irresponsible landlords watch their bank accounts grow and ignore the shivers of tenants who endure another winter with no heat. But we won't ignore it. The problem of tenant displacement is urgent. The Quad Cities Tenant Alliance says enough. We can do better, and we all know it. Another world is possible. Together, let's create a Quad Cities where we all can live. We also would like to mention that there is Spanish interpretation available tonight. Please go to the sign-in table for information about how to use a headset if you have not already. Again, thank you for coming.
My name is Gavin Gaspin. Put the mic closer. You can hear me now? All right, I got to tilt this thing up here. How's that? Thanks again for coming. I am a former tenant of Mr. Andrew Wold, and I am a member of the Quad City Tenant Alliance. We are here today to present you our proposal for a Davenport rent abatement ordinance and to hear questions from you about the community. This proposal for rent abatement ordinance is by tenants and for tenants. A rent abatement ordinance allows our inspections department to excuse tenants from paying rent when there is a serious threat to life and safety. As Davenport renters, we're disturbed by the number of involuntary displacements that happened in Davenport. I got involved with the Tenant Alliance when the Crestwood and East 35th Street apartments were evacuated in 2021. More than 100 tenants were displaced. Some of those tenants were displaced again. I'm invested in passing a rent abatement ordinance because of my own experience as a Davenport renter. After months of water damage in my apartment and my landlord's neglect, if you know Andrew Wold, you know his neglect, the ceiling in my apartment caved in on my bed. Thankfully, I wasn't home. At that point, I realized I needed to get the city involved, and the city was helpful. They got some compliance from the landlord. They got the ceiling fixed. They got the heat, water, ceiling working again. But the damage started happening again, and I was not confident that the city could get the compliance they needed from the landlord. I had to move, because it was not an option to stay in that building. I found out later that the building has been condemned. That building is 917 West 3rd Street. It's not far from here. I walk past that building every day. It was a beautiful apartment, you know, when I moved in. Rough around the edges, but it's right in front of Tommy's Cafe. It's got a view of the river, it's got a view of the bridge. We want that apartment available in Davenport, but it's not now. If inspectors had better tools for motivating owners to make repairs, that building might still be available to rent. I got feedback. Give them a second. Maybe I wouldn't have had to move. I want to see a rent abatement ordinance on the city's council agenda. I want to prevent these displacements from happening week after week. the collapse at 324 Main Street pushed the Tenant Alliance to investigate changes to city code that could prevent these evacuations, get to the root of the problem. We reached out to Iowa City's lead inspector, Stan Laverman, to learn more. We're going to have an interview with him in a minute. After we found out about it, we voted unanimously to support a rent abatement ordinance in Davenport. We know that building inspectors often face a catch-22 when attempting to enforce the code. When substandard buildings are condemned, Davenport renters are displaced. When the buildings are not condemned, there can be catastrophic consequences. At the Housing Justice Forum tonight, we'd like to share with you why we think passing the rent abatement ordinance is just common sense. We believe it'll make the Quad Cities a safer place to live. Number one, the rent abatement ordinance will prevent tenant displacement by motivating owners to fix things before buildings need to get shut down. A rent abatement ordinance will protect displaced tenants by keeping money in their pockets if, God forbid, it does need to be vacated later on. And lastly, a rent abatement ordinance will preserve existing rental housing by improving compliance with building code so that the rental housing shortage doesn't get worse. By providing inspectors with better tools to enforce the code, we can keep tenants housed. And as you'll see in a minute, the city won't have to spend a dime to make it happen. Over the past month, we have met with many city council members, the majority of them, to share a proposal. 4 city council members, I'm going to say their names: Ben Jobjan, Jade Burkholder, Micho Lynch, and Tim Kelly, have all committed to voting yes, provided they get approved from their legal advisors. We are hopeful that we can get this on the city council's agenda soon, but we'll need the community's support to ensure it passes. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Stan Laverman, Iowa City's lead inspector, to our forum, and Beth Longlet, a board member of Quad Cities Interfaith and a member of the Quad Cities Tenant Alliance and Zion Lutheran Church, to interview Stan before taking questions from the community. During the first half of the interview, you are invited to write on the note cards provided in your pew. We want this to be a good learning experience for everyone, so please ask lots of questions. Mr. Dennis Platt, another member of the Quad Cities Tenant Alliance, will join me in coming to collect your cards and delivering them to Beth to be read during the second half of the interview. Now please join me in welcoming Stan Laverman, Iowa City's lead inspector.
Thank you. Let me know if I need to be louder.
Hi, Stan.
Hello.
Thanks for making the trip over to Davenport.
Yeah.
As Gavin said, please write your questions on the note cards in your pews. And after we hear a little more about the rent abatement ordinance from Stan, we'll collect the cards and answer your questions. Now, let's get to it. Okay, first question, Stan. What is a rent abatement ordinance?
Sure. So the information that we've heard already describing the rent abatement ordinance is accurate. It's a tool that the state has allowed cities to use. It comes from state code that allows cities to adopt an ordinance that in situations where there are substantial deficiencies according to the housing code, that the city can issue a notice of rent abatement, that the landlord is not allowed to collect rent from the tenants. It's not a case where rent is put into escrow, but it has to be paid later. It's a specific abatement that says you cannot collect rent from this point forward.
Thank you. How did this come about? Was there a catalyst or an event for the rent abatement ordinance for Iowa City?
It's interesting because I was reading some of the information that was put out listing a 2017 incident with a large apartment complex in Iowa City that went through a period of where multiple tenants were displaced. I wish it was that simple. I think we're going to prove that Iowa City, that while we might have this one figured out now, at the time that we didn't even have it figured out, and we were facing things that we didn't realize we were facing. So this complex in the early 2000s was owned by a property manager who met the minimum standard and would frequently try to set the minimum standard for the property. For many years, we struggled with getting him to come into compliance. And about the time that we were looking to take action to shut the place down completely, he sold it. A company out of Chicago bought it. They came in with great aspirations. They were going to use the global supply chain to renovate these units. We were going to have granite countertops, hard surface flooring, new stainless steel kitchen appliances, all this. They were even looking at creating affordable housing options, that they were going to take some of the townhouses and split them off for owner occupancy. The unfortunate part about it is they didn't really check with our building and zoning department before they made these purchases and these promises, because there was things that they didn't want to fix. What it turned out is they were kind of going to do what I affectionately call the lipstick on a pig. They were going to look pretty, but the major mechanical systems behind the walls were not going to be what they needed to be. So they ran into roadblocks, and there was issues that came up, and they fixed a few units, and they tried, and that was almost worse because that was their advertisement. They would do the bait and switch. They would bring people in, and there were these beautiful units that they would show people, and then as it would happen, no one qualified for those units. Their credit wasn't good enough, their income wasn't good enough, and just a whole variety of things that would prevent people from moving into those units. What happened is their financing over time became more than they could handle, and it was bought out by another company. And it was actually a decent company who had plans to bring it back up to date. And what they found out as they got into it is there was so much deferred maintenance on the property that they couldn't accomplish what they needed to do. And it was a company that actually had a lot of experience rehabbing multifamily units like this and converting them into affordable rental situations. So they had good intentions, but the building was too far gone. Iowa City is the home of the University of Iowa. There's a huge demand for student housing. A company that had built multiple student housing units ended up purchasing the property, removing all the tenants, and rebuilding it as student housing. So after this took place, we kind of did a deep dive into what could have we done differently over the past, what turned out to be 17 years. So there's a pretty good example of, we didn't have it right. There was a lot of years that tenants lived in buildings where it was substandard. There was times that I was out to that building once a week to verify pest control was being done, and that's what it took to verify that work was getting done. You had to be there to make sure the work was getting done. Out of it, we have a lot of development in Iowa City and a lot of development pressure. So part of it to protect tenants, when large complexes like this are redeveloped in the future, we have assistance for the tenants that are displaced, moving assistance, deposit assistance, and then we also implemented the rent abatement at that time, because there was multiple occasions where we should have taken additional steps, but we weren't aware of the tool of rent abatement. In 2008, it was so bad that we removed Section 8 or housing choice vouchers from the property, because we just didn't have confidence that these units were going to stay in compliance. So while it seems like in 2017 that we had this grand vision and we protected tenants immediately, it's not. That's a story that's been cleaned up a little bit. We were in the weeds for a long time. So when a lot of people are saying, well, why are you here? I think it's important for us to kind of admit to the mistakes that we made. We're not perfect in Iowa City, and we need to pay it forward and make sure other people are aware of this opportunity.
Thank you. Sasha, can you talk a little bit about the procedures for enforcing a rent abatement ordinance?
Sure. The process is pretty simple. We have, as Davenport would have, we have processes in place for a typical systematic rental inspection. On a typical inspection, people are given 30 days to correct items. Obviously, there's certain things on a complaint inspection where they may have less time. If it's a fire life safety item, it may be 24 hours. For other things, it may be 7 days. But there's still, a narrow time frame of when things have to be fixed. From there, if people are working on it, we will work with them, give them extra time to correct it, as long as we're seeing steps being taken. In the state of Iowa, we also have the civil citation process, which is good and bad. If they're not correcting it, I can issue a civil citation for noncompliance with the housing code. It gets in front of a judge. The judge will find, usually in our favor by the time we get it there, because our documentation is good. But again, this is pushing it out another 30, 60, 90 days. The court systems are overloaded in our area as well, so it takes a while to get in front of a judge sometime. Sometimes the judge will give them more time than we wish they would give them. But again, it just pushes it out, and the whole time you have a tenant living in those situations. The nice thing about rent abatement is that my inspectors can come to me and say, we've taken these steps. And typically we do get through the citation process before we go to rent abatement. But they can say, we've taken all these steps, we're still in non-compliance. We have multiple checks and balances. That inspector has to prove to me their documentation's in place. I take it to our building official, and the building official issues a notice of rent abatement. We like to time these, honestly, because we have waited a period of time. We like to wait about 15 days before the end of the month. And the reason is we give a 10-day notice for one final opportunity to correct. And honestly, once they get that notice that they're not getting rent next month, it's amazing all the roadblocks that go away, for the most part. Not all of them are wins. We don't, but there's a lot of times it's corrected immediately, and we're able to issue the rental permit and move on.
Thank you. So this is kind of my question, but can the rent abatement ordinance be issued in a situation where the tenants can actually still live in the building?
So that's one of the things I hear you guys talking about, buildings and avoiding that situation where tenants have to move out. It's a narrow window of, is it safe enough for you to live there, but is some major function gone? So the building doesn't have heat. In the dead of winter, we're not going to be able to allow tenants to stay there. But you get into the spring, and it might be uncomfortable, but when you start to choose between would I rather be outside or in a building that doesn't have heat, that's a perfect example of, okay, we can make this work. There's water, but there's not hot water. Well, people can take other steps to make sure that they have hot water if they need it. So all of those things are decided on a case-by-case basis. On certain instances, you have to placard and evict, or not evict, but shut the building down.
Great question, Beth.
Thank you, Ivy. How often have you had to use the rent abatement ordinance?
Sure. In 7 years, we've used it 14 times, which isn't a lot. But the fact that my inspectors have the ability to do rent abatement is probably more valuable than actually doing it. You guys have seen some of the memes lately about people crossing the street in the crosswalk, and there's bricks that you can pick up before you cross the crosswalk to make sure the cars stop. Rent abatement's like that brick. Like, you're carrying that brick, people are like, okay, they're serious. They could use it, so let's stop. So that's how I would envision it, that the fact that we have the tool really just gives us a little extra, the words that we say carry a little extra weight when that happens.
How does that impact the workload of the inspectors?
The inspectors, it's just another tool. It doesn't really add to it. There's a little bit of paperwork, but it's less paperwork than issuing another civil citation and going to court and getting a court order to actually correct the work ourselves. So it's less work, honestly, than anything else.
Good to hear. How does it complement fees to the landlords?
Sure, because it's an immediate action. The fact that they're not collecting rent immediately is a bigger deterrent than, say, a civil citation. And civil citations for Iowa City start out at $250 and go up to a maximum of $750. $750 is the max that's allowed by the state. And those we can issue daily. We rarely do that just because of the legal time that it takes. But you have to collect those fees. They will get assessed to the taxes eventually, but it kind of gets pushed out. But the fact that a landlord can't collect rent the next month really kind of grabs their attention more than anything.
I would agree. And so you kind of started leading into this, but how does it motivate landlord compliance?
For the most part, you're not going to get a rent check the next month. So as long as we have compliance from tenants, and tenants understand the process that they don't have to pay rent, it's very helpful.
Great. Has the rent abatement ordinance faced any legal challenges?
We had one landlord that took a property that was a duplex and was converting it to a single family without permits, and had removed walls and done all sorts of electrical work. And he was not coming into compliance, and we issued a notice of rent abatement. Eventually, he tried to evict the tenants. Luckily, the tenants let us know, and we appeared in court as a friend of the court and provided the magistrate with the information on rent abatement, and he agreed with us, and the tenants were not evicted. The small claims action, again, was also thrown out because what the landlord was trying to do wasn't legal.
So protection. Let's talk about landlords. Does the rent abatement ordinance unfairly target landlords?
The landlords that are doing the right thing, which in my community is a great majority of them, they're for it. It's the landlords that are skirting the law that who feel any action against them is unfair. They will definitely think this is unfair.
Okay. You've touched on this a little bit, but how do you determine if a landlord is compliant resistant?
We have good documentation. We're fortunate that we have a land use software that has records that go back to at least 1992. And there's just a pattern that develops over time of landlords that exhaust every extension and are resistant. It's pretty easy to pick out the ones that continue to not come into compliance.
Thank you. Now for the best part, tenant protections. How are tenants protected by a rent abatement ordinance?
So this is tenants that are in a lease longer than 30 days are really protected. I would caution that tenants that are in a month-to-month lease, we had an instance this year where, because they were in a month-to-month lease, that once rent abatement was issued, the landlord quickly gave them 30-day notice that their lease would not be renewed. So that's kind of a little bit of a warning. It really works best if people are in long-term leases with a defined lease term. If tenants are in a 30-day lease, it can become a little bit problematic that they will be moved out quicker than others. Again, it will give a tenant the opportunity, hopefully, to get at least 1 month's rent in the bank, so as they move that they have some funds to help with additional deposit and other things.
Okay. How has the rent abatement ordinance contributed to the preservation of rental housing and prevention of involuntary displacement in Iowa City?
Right. So it's one tool in our toolbox. There's other things, systematic. In Iowa City, I feel that I'm fortunate that our housing division is well funded. I have 5 staff members that handle nearly 20,000 rental units. So while, honestly, rent abatement for me is just, while it might not preserve housing, it does compensate tenants that are suffering at the hand of a delinquent or landlord that isn't in compliance. I can't say that it preserves housing. I would say that strong enforcement of the housing code and systematic rental housing code preserves the housing, and this is just one final tool to make sure that landlords are following the housing code.
Thank you very much, Dan. Well, I hope our conversation sparked questions from those in the audience. Let's take some time to answer questions from community members to dig a little deeper into rent abatement ordinance. Are my question rovers ready? I think they're still compiling.
We have one, and her voice is loud enough that I'm going to hear this one.
Ivy.
Sure, good question. So the question was, is it currently enforced? How often do we inspect, and then who pays the fines? So yes, we currently use the rent abatement. We've been using it since 2017. We've used it 14 times in that 7-year period. We're fortunate because of the staffing that we have with our inspection department that older multifamily properties are inspected once a year. And we consider older anything that's older than 1993 at this point. 93 and on is sprinkled, so you have additional protections, and those are inspected every 2 years. But we deal with a different population in Iowa City as well. I mean, we have regular folks living in apartments, but we deal with a lot of college students. So we have a different animal. So, but again, we also see, and the reason we went to a year inspection on a lot of those properties is that we were seeing that a lot of landlords weren't doing anything unless we inspected. So. Sure. It's a case-by-case basis. Typically, we're going one civil citation before we're going to rent abatement. Yep.
All right. Well, we've got some from the audience. Here's one. How can area social workers better assist or help families access affordable housing for displaced families, such as city code violation, et cetera?
You're making me put on a different hat here. Okay. We're fortunate also that 7 years ago, I moved into community development, so I can handle this. I think communication is key. A lot of times you have tenants that are afraid to bring issues to the city's attention. They're afraid of retaliation. We've also seen it where landlords like to maybe get tenants half a month or a month in arrears on rent, because then they feel that they can do whatever they want for the tenant, because the tenant brings something to our attention, and the next thing you know, the tenant has a notice that they're behind on rent. It's very important to note that a housing code violation is always a housing code violation. It doesn't matter if you're behind on rent or not. So I think social workers working with tenants to make sure that they're comfortable and trust their city staff, and hopefully you have city staff you can trust to enforce the code. That's the key for me, that open line of communication, so we know what's going on, so we can come in and correct the items that we see.
All right, thank you. Can a landlord evict tenants if the renter complains?
Well, a landlord will evict tenants when they complain, but that's considered retaliation. It's not the easiest to prove. In Iowa City, most of our tenants are on year leases, which makes it a little bit more difficult. So we see periodic times where we have retaliation, but it's a little harder on that month to month. There has to be, I think you have to build a case for that. I know it's difficult. That doesn't roll through our office, and this is something that's also an issue. You know, as a housing inspector, I'm in charge of city housing code. I don't handle lease violations. So that's a whole nother department and a whole nother animal.
If a tenant has 24 hours, what are tenants to do? How do tenants get to that point? Where do they go?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard place to be in. And hopefully, with good systematic rental inspections and that we're not getting to a point where the city is saying you have to be out in 24 hours. Hopefully, you can get it solved before then. There's not a good place to go. Let's just be honest. That if you have to move in 24 hours, you're leaving a lot of stuff behind, and you're doubling up somewhere, and it's not a good situation.
All right, another one. Do you have any opinion on Davenport's inspection program? On the spot.
I will not do that. Because, as I said, we're not perfect in Iowa City, and I could go through my phone and I can give you emails of tenants that aren't happy with me right now. You know, I feel I'm justified in what I'm telling them, but I can tell you, at the point that they're in the situation they're in, it's, you know, housing is a human right. Let's start with that. And if that's being
Amen. Yeah.
threatened, the last thing you want is the stupid city inspector telling you that he can't do anything for you, you know, and you made a complaint, and now your landlord's retaliating against you. I might agree with you that they are, but again, that's a legal issue. I can't do anything about that. You know, as a human, do I tuck that in the back of my mind the next time I'm working with that landlord? I'm supposed to tell you no. But yeah, I mean, you develop a rapport and you understand where tenants are coming from and where landlords are coming from. Look, we learned a lot from what happened in Davenport. Those are tough decisions to make. And I'll admit that in December, we had a building where a brick wall started coming away from the house, and we quickly determined that it was a structural wall, and we handled it a lot differently because of what happened in Davenport than we would have in the past. So I'm sorry that happened. We learned a lot from it.
Who would be in charge of the rent abatement procedure in Davenport?
That would be something that the management would have to decide. We have chosen to put multiple steps in place and checks and balances. My inspectors can't just run with it. I can't run with it. I have to go to our building official and present the case of why we want to do it. So I think with that, landlords, you know, don't need rogue inspectors going out there and holding grudges against people. And I think you can make the case that 3 different people looked at this, and yes, we all are in the same department, but it does provide a sense of accountability that we have our documentation, we've done the necessary steps, and this is the last resort.
Thank you. A new property manager has come in August and September, and they know we don't have any smoke detectors or anything like it. Is that something that's covered by the abatement ordinance?
The absence of smoke detectors, if they're all, there's nuances to this. Rent abatement is a big stick, okay? The state grants us authority to use that. I think it's important to use it appropriately and rarely. I think there's other ways to gain compliance. It's a new property manager. I would take the time to do some education. Yes, if we didn't get compliance within a couple days, there would be additional remedies to that. I think rent abatement has to be used carefully, though. With the political climate that we face in the state of Iowa, the state could quickly go through, change the code, and remove this tool, which I feel is a very important tool in certain situations.
Okay, thank you. Was there originally resistance to this ordinance before it was adopted by city officials, landlords? Were questions answered satisfactorily?
We have a unique situation in Iowa. Maybe it's not unique. For me, it's unique, and I think the state lobbyist thinks it's unique. We have a landlord association group that I go to. Well, they meet 9 times a year because you can't meet at Christmas time. You can't meet at August 1st because that's turnover in Iowa City, and then there's another one they don't meet. But so I attend their meetings on a monthly basis. So I go and take my beatings, right at the source. Because I think that communication is key. I think we have a working relationship. At the end of the day, it's a very small community, and I don't want something to develop over a month and people get unnecessarily perturbed by something. So if I show up, answer questions, it goes a lot better. So the core landlord group who are doing what they need to do had no problem with it whatsoever.
What changes in state law would enhance the tenant access to affordable, quality housing? This comes from one of our state representatives.
If I could answer that, I would not be here. That's a great question, isn't it? Yeah, well, there are certain things that we've tried to do in Iowa City. As new developments come online and they're asking for additional occupancy, we have affordable housing requirements. We don't have the answer either. I think that's a tough question. The capitalist in me says, build, baby, build. Let's just keep building, and as we build more, those older units become more and more affordable. Supply, just flood the market. And at the same point, as I live in my neighborhood way too close to campus, I'm like, no, I don't want that. So I think that's a tough question. In Iowa City, we've also changed our zoning code a little bit to allow duplexes by right, which some of these older homes are suitable for multi-units. They end up looking the same, but there's better use of that property. I think it's going to take a lot of us taking a hard look at how we live and what we're comfortable with, and to solve that problem.
Thank you. Who decides whether or not a security deposit will be returned to a tenant?
Sure. So security deposit, that is not within my jurisdiction. That's part of the legal side of it, the lease issue part of it. The state has been abundantly clear that cities should not interfere with that lease portion of it. What I always recommend is tenants document, the condition of the apartment when they move in, and document the condition when they move out. Our magistrates in Iowa City are well versed in that question. I think you have to be comfortable, using the small claims court system and advocating for yourself to get the full deposit back sometimes.
If 4 support beams for the house are loose in a basement holding up the floor and the landlord hasn't done anything, does this qualify for rent abatement ordinance? The support beams are missing wood chunks.
Sure. So I don't do inspections over the phone. Again, these would be case-by-case decisions. Hopefully, through systematic inspections, it's not getting to that point. If it's getting to that point quickly, and it can't be, there's a lot of shoring work that could be done in a very short amount of time to make sure that you're not going to have a building collapse. But again, without looking in, I can't weigh in on it from here.
Okay. We just have a couple more that we have time for. Who or what entity would be doing the inspections in Davenport? The city inspectors, the housing authority, the fire department?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with your system here in Davenport. I think you have a housing inspection division, so I think they're the ones that are doing that, but I haven't spent a lot of time
Okay.
understanding that.
Who does it in Iowa City?
It's us, it's housing inspectors.
Okay, thank you.
My joke is, in some instances, the fire department does it. In other communities, we joke that the housing inspectors do our job so the fire department doesn't have to work.
Thank you. Okay, last question. Will this ordinance increase costs to the taxpayers of Davenport?
I don't see how it would. It's just another tool, much like civil citations, much like a notice of violation. It needs to be enforced. But in the whole scheme of things, I don't see how it adds a great expense to the taxpayers of the city.
Thank you very much, Stan, for sharing about this policy. We've learned a lot about how the rent abatement ordinance protects displaced tenants, prevents involuntary displacement, and preserves existing rental housing. Now let's hear a story from Ashley Hendley, a tenant who was displaced from her home last winter.
Sorry about this. Okay. Hello again. You know, my name's Ruth Quick. I'm not Ashley. Ashley's a tenant who has experienced firsthand involuntary displacement, what it's like, and due to illness, Ashley could not make it tonight. Unfortunately, she's ill. So I will share her testimony. It's heartbreaking. My partner and I lived in a duplex owned by Andrew Bold Investments. And I am sure most of you know Andrew Wold also owned the building that collapsed at 324 Main Street, so his name's famous. About a year ago, every month we would pay Wold $750. And yet, from the moment we moved in, it was dangerous to even enter our own house. The steps literally collapsed under our feet as the wood split. Our home was infested with mice, and our furniture was infested with bed bugs. Yeah. We had to leave everything behind to avoid bringing bugs with us. The mold was so severe, I got pneumonia for several months. But the worst problem was the sewage coming out of our faucets. Can you imagine dealing with itchy bed bugs and having to shower with sewage water? It was inhumane. I support a rent abatement ordinance because no human being should have to clean their dishes with raw sewage in their water. Our landlord's negligence impacted every area of our lives, our physical well-being, our mental health, and our financial stability. When the city condemned our building, we had to leave on very short notice. We had to come up with funds for a hotel, first and last month's rent, and a security deposit. The financial blow was devastating. We had difficulty addressing dental problems, keeping our jobs, maintaining our vehicles, attending to my health and disability, and keeping food on the table. It had been 6 months, and we are still struggling impending homelessness. The ripple effects of displacement are endless. Asking for help when we were displaced was one of the hardest things I have ever done. I was ashamed that I had to ask family and friends for money just to survive. Somehow, it seemed we had failed at being adults. But I have realized that what happened to us was not our fault. There is a clear pattern of building neglect in the Quad Cities, causing displacement after displacement after displacement. This is a problem with the systems we have in place to protect tenants, not a problem with tenant renters, individual renters. A systemic problem needs a systemic solution, a policy solution. I support a rent abatement ordinance because it is a common sense public policy to keep buildings safe and decent for everyone who lives there. A rent abatement ordinance protects displaced tenants by allowing us to set aside our rent money for moving costs if our building is condemned. An extra $750 wouldn't have solved everything, but would have given me some immediate relief in my situation. As the struggle for housing justice continues, renters and our allies will need to develop policy solutions to cover all relocation expenses. Many tenants are afraid to speak out. Speaking out is very risky when we feel so powerless. I am still scared, but even though I am scared, I am speaking out because I have hope that when we shine a light on the problem, a pathway towards the solution will emerge. Our power is in our numbers. I joined, and myself, the Quad Cities Tenant Alliance because we need to build a base of tenants who will stand up for ourselves. And we need the whole community to see our struggle and join us. Today, we are asking the decision makers in our community, our Davenport City Council, to put housing justice on your agenda. Thank you.
Once again, thank you everyone for coming to the Housing Justice Community Forum. My name is Dennis Platt, and I'm a member of the Quad City Tenant Alliance. As you already know, Beth Longlet is here to my left. While Beth gets set up there, I want to plug a couple upcoming events. We have a Know Your Rights training session coming up July 22nd. We're partnering with Iowa Legal Aid to provide particular training for tenants in Davenport, Iowa, or on the Iowa side of the river anyway. That's going to be at 5 p.m. at the Davenport Public Library on Main Street. We would love to see you at our monthly Quad City Tenant Alliance meetings as well. We'd love everyone to feel comfortable and to come. We meet the third Tuesday of every month at 6 p.m., 130 West 5th Street. That would be St. Anthony's Grace Center. During those meetings, our whole activities are centered around getting organized around housing justice. As we campaign for a rent abatement ordinance campaign for a rent abatement ordinance, we invite you to join in our conversations about strategy and planning. We know that our inspectors need better tools. We know they need more tools. We know that when you don't have the right tool, usually you screw something up. There's collateral damage. If you've ever tried to use a screwdriver as a chisel, you're going to find out you're going to be buying more screwdrivers. And in the case of housing inspectors, when they don't have the right tools, the collateral damage ends up being the tenants. They have involuntary displacements, often at their own cost, often without any help or support in any way, and often on very short notice.
So the bottom line is, a Davenport rent abatement ordinance would protect displaced tenants, prevent displacement, and preserve existing rental housing, and it wouldn't cost the city a dime to make it happen.
For the past month, the Quad Cities Tenant Alliance has been meeting with Davenport City Council members, engaging their support. At every meeting, we will ask, will you vote yes on a rent abatement ordinance if it is introduced at City Council? So far, we have 4 yeses from Alderman Jade Burkholder, Alderman Ben Jabokin, Alderman Mishu Lynch, and Alderman Tim Kelly. Others we've spoken with are very supportive of bringing all of these ideas and questions to a work session in front of their legal counsel. And we're very supportive of that because we would rather measure twice and cut once. We want to do this right, and we want to do it strong.
We believe that with enough community support, we will see this on the City Council agenda by this coming fall. We are thrilled to see emerging support from Davenport City Council, but we need your help to ensure that housing justice gets on the agenda. We support a rent abatement ordinance because we must say, as a community, no more displacements. Say it with me.
No more displacements.
No more displacements. No more displacements. That's why we're asking you to call and email Davenport City Council to share why you support a rent abatement ordinance. In your pews, there are flyers with a QR code. To email your City Council members, all you have to do is scan the QR code and fill out the form. So if you have a phone that can do that, let's do that. And if you don't have a smartphone, our tech genius, Gavin Gassman, is in the back to help you with that. But let's all, if everybody who has a smartphone can get their phone out, and let's scan that QR code. And let's fill it out and let's flood their inboxes. Also invite your family, friends, and especially your neighbors to send an email as well. Over the next few weeks, please call your City Council members too. Nothing beats a good old-fashioned phone call. The numbers of the City Council members are available on the flyer with the QR code and on the City of Davenport's website. Now, who will commit to calling their alderpersons in support of a rent abatement ordinance? Raise your hands. Who will commit to attending a City Council meeting to express your support for a rent abatement ordinance? I'm so excited to see so much support from the community. Be on the lookout for an email with our next action date. And finally, thank you so much for coming, and have a wonderful evening. And don't forget, tomorrow are primary elections, so make sure you get out and vote.